You did, however, leave out a very important fact of my accomplishments. With the exception of one other person, I have the biggest name in political science. 15 letters, 2 spaces, nobody's name is longer than mine. It's a good thing. It's really a thrill to be here. The whole visit is a thrill. I had a great time yesterday at the workshop, and this conference is wonderful. And tomorrow will be particularly, a very nice thing. What I want to do this morning is talk a little bit about Carmela and Benny's book in the context of the way I think about international relations and how they fit together. This is, as has already been said correctly, a fantastic book. It's an important book. It's a book that people need to know about. It asks extremely important questions, and remarkably, and it's one of the striking elements to me in really good research. Really good research has the characteristic that you read what the question is, and then you say to yourself, how come nobody's asked this before? This is the right question. And that's what this work does. It's fantastic. It asks the question, why was Europe able to transition to what is described as warm peace? The book asks the question, why Europe was able to transition to a warm peace, and the Middle East thus far has not. And it offers an answer, or a way to think about the answer. It offers a theory. I don't want to do too much detail because that's obviously what the conference will be about. But essentially, what the theory says is that we have a variable to explain, which is the nature of the relationship between states, in this context, particularly regional neighbors. Do they have a relationship of hot war? They're fighting with each other. Cold war, where the probability that there would be fighting is low, but not zero. Cold peace, where the probability that they would fight today is essentially zero, but in the future, the risk is there. A nominal peace, there's a chance of war. And a high-level peace, where the probability of war is zero. That's the European world, I'll say the West European world today. And of course, what we want to understand is how to move states from the bad end of that distribution to the more peaceful end of the distribution. And the chapters of the book all address, through various ways, how to achieve that objective. As the theoretical chapter discusses, we have a notion, for example, of offensive realism, which leads to a cold peace, such as between Egypt and Israel, not a consequential chance of war, but it's not the United States and Britain. And we have defensive realism, which gives us things like the Cold War and Cold Peace, offensive liberalism, and defensive liberalism. These will all be talked about at length. And I want to talk about how the way I think about things fits with that framework and how that framework fits with how I think about things. Admittedly, I think about things somewhat bizarrely from the perspective of many people, understandably so. So, I start with the observation that a difficulty that we have to face in diminishing the role of conflict in the state system and moving states to the happier relationships, a difficulty that we face is that democracies, such as is much of Europe, contrary to what many of us like to believe is the case, are not particularly interested, sadly, in promoting democracy elsewhere. Now, there's an exception. The exceptions are, by definition, not common. The exceptions arise when there are shared policy interests elsewhere and by the potentially influencing state or states. So we can think about the Marshall Plan, where the United States had an interest at the end of the war in restoring the European economies and European democracy in a format that would be pro-US and against the Soviet Union. So there was a strong interest, and just about everybody in Europe prior to the war already had experience with democratic government. So there was a partnership that was natural. It was not hard to persuade most of Europe that they should be strongly democratic. It was more of a challenge to persuade some in Europe to adopt free trade and so forth. But before the war, from the late 19th century into the early 20th century, Europe had largely been a free trade region. There had been a tremendous increase in trade around the world, which then collapsed, of course, with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs and so forth. So Europe was not a tough challenge. By comparison, of course, the United States offered the same deal to the Soviet Union and its East European friends, or they weren't exactly friends, but they're allies. And they, of course, rejected it because it would have required that they abandon their view of how to try to run the world. So the Marshall Plan was a nice example of a victorious state that had suffered relatively little in the war, the United States, using its deep pockets to shape policy elsewhere to entrench democratic, liberal economic policy. So it can be done. For me, however, the focus is on why is something like that done, and the focus there is about leaders rather than the state. This is where I move a little aside. If we look at the behavior in terms of democracy promotion from the perspective of leaders rather than states, we come to a very different normative and empirical view of what is likely to happen. Normatively, we all understand it would be nice if everybody were democratic. If you believe in the democratic peace, which I certainly do, at the end of the line, you'd have a peaceful world. The difficulty is, what is the job of a democratic leader? Is the job of a democratic leader to make the world a better place? It's not their job. They're not against making the world a better place. Nobody is against making the world a better place, but it's not their objective. It's not their priority. The objective of a democratic leader is to get reelected. That's their job. And that means doing what their constituents want. So their constituents will want democracy elsewhere in the world if it's friendly democracy. If it's not friendly democracy, they're not going to want it. Now, how might they promote democratic reform? They might give foreign aid to induce countries to become more democratic. I have a recent PhD who did a lovely study in which he found the conditions under which democracies would use foreign aid to promote democracy. If you think about the range of things you can do in foreign aid being like this, the set of cases in which you could promote democracy was like that. And they're easily explained. So he looked at it, and he thought about trying to criticize my work, always admirable in my students. He thought, well, in my view of the world, in the selector theory view of the world, foreign aid is given to advance the political interests of the leaders who are giving the aid and the political interests of the leaders who are getting the aid. What are those interests? So he said, well, the primary interests are to buy security concessions. The United States in the 1950s spent a lot of money in Pakistan to be allowed to have bases in Pakistan where we could listen in on the Soviet Union, for example. So to buy security or to buy better trade relations. And so he organized his data around the countries that meet this primary qualification. They have valuable security concessions to sell, or they have valuable commercial concessions to sell. And then he's left with a little slice of states he calls the secondary states. And those states, at the margin, might be places where the citizens at home would think, well, this place is of no value to us, but maybe we could encourage them to liberalize their politics a bit. And he found a very weak statistical association, but a significant one, that in that little slice where they had no particular value in trade and no particular value in security, a small percentage of those could be induced to liberalize. So it's not impossible from an external perspective to promote liberalization, but it's difficult. Now, people naturally think of the post-World War II obvious examples. When the United States in 2003 went into Iraq, Paul Wolfowitz, right after, said, okay, nation building. We did it in Germany. We did it in Japan. We can do it in Iraq. And a few months later, the Iraqis had a made-up constitution by then a colleague of mine at NYU, Noah Feldman, and they had an election. I won't go into it was a bogus election, but we won't go into that. In any event, that didn't matter. They seem to have forgotten that in Germany and Japan, the first non-militarily supervised elections were approximately 10 years after the war ended. And in those 10 years, what the victorious Allies did is write constitutions for Germany and a constitution for Japan. By the way, I don't have time today, but the German constitution that was written was shocking. Adolf Hitler came to power, I'll go a little bit. Adolf Hitler came to power in an extreme proportional representation system. And what did the Allies give Germany? An extreme proportional representation system, which unfortunately, I will come to this, your country has adopted. They did this because they wanted weak governments in Germany. And what did they do in Japan? In Japan, they wrote a constitution where the rural constituents were overwhelmingly overrepresented in the parliament, in the Diet. They were conservative. They would do what leaders told them, as opposed to the urban dwellers who were much more socialist. And so, when we say we built democracy, what we built was governments that would do what we wanted. And they did. And the first time Germany deviated from what we wanted, when Willy Brandt had this silly idea that he would follow the gravity model of trade and trade with his next door neighbors who happened to be East European, a scandal was suddenly discovered and he was out of office. And the Germans didn't deviate again until the end of the Cold War on any material security matter. And the Japanese didn't deviate from American foreign policy until the end of the Cold War. And if you look at Freedom House, even today, Japan is the only major, wealthy, allegedly democratic country that is rated as not having a free press, but only a semi-free press. So the external democracy building is a very difficult problem. Now, so what we did is we imposed rules to limit what the vanquished states could do. Carmela's chapter is about imposing rules to limit what vanquished states can do. That's how external democracy gets to be built. Mostly democratic victors encourage autocracy. May have window dressing, but they encourage autocracy for a very simple reason. For money, autocrats don't have to worry about making their citizens relatively miserable as long as they're not so miserable that they'll revolt. Autocrats need money to keep their cronies loyal. So they're willing to sell policy to the United States, to Britain, to France, to Sweden, to whomever, so that the donor is getting the policy concessions that their constituents at home want, and the recipient is getting concessions that they want. There are 4 constituencies affected by aid: the donor leader, the donor supporters, the recipient leader, and the people of the recipient state. And 3 of those constituencies benefit from foreign aid. Donors make their constituents happy that at the margin they got some policy concessions, and at the margin foreign aid has very small effects, but and therefore it's very little money, and at the margin it increases their re-election probability. And the citizens are happy, that's why it increases the re-election probability, because at the margin they got some concessions. The recipient government and their cronies have gotten what they want, money, so they're winners. The only people who are losers in foreign aid are the citizens of the recipient country who were hoping to have their misery alleviated, and it is reinforced by foreign aid. The odds of a dictator being in office next year conditional on getting an average amount of per capita foreign aid increases by 1/3. It's great if you are, that's the fact. It's great if you're a dictator. Which, by the way, if you have the opportunity, I strongly recommend it as a job. It's a very good job. Much, much better than being a democratic leader. The average democratic leader lasts in office for about 3 years. Autocrats who survive the first 2 years die in their sleep, still in their job. It's great business. It's great. Okay. So, from the way I think about things, democratization, political reform, the sorts of things that happened in Europe that can make for a warm peace, primarily have to be derived from within the state, not from international relations. To get states to democratize, they have to have internal reasons, usually deep problems, that could be solved by political reform. A quick, very brief example. Kwame Nkrumah destroyed the economy of Ghana. He was a well-intentioned man. He had the idea that this agricultural society should have heavy industry. And he spent a lot of money trying to build heavy industry. Of course, it failed. They had no comparative advantage in heavy industry. He was replaced by J.J. Rawlings. J.J. Rawlings was a petty, thieving, corrupt dictator. And he slowly but steadily bankrupted Ghana, and capable workers in Ghana left the country and went to Uganda and so forth to make a living. Now, you know things are bad when going to Uganda is the attractive option. Well, eventually the country was bankrupt, and he thought, what can I do? I can't keep paying off the army, my cronies, I'm in deep trouble. And he had a great insight. I need to generate a good economy. This is, by the way, an insight that Chiang Kai-shek had in Taiwan. I need to generate a good economy. How can I quickly generate a better economy? I'm going to become a democracy. So he invited the folks who went to Uganda and so forth to come back, and of course they initially said, no, why would we do that? So he set up an electoral system that was genuinely free and fair, a genuinely legitimate electoral system, and people came back. And they saw the economy taking off, they held an election, he got elected. It was an honest election, he got elected, and then the next election came up again, and he lost. And he stepped down, and Ghana became a democracy, and a relatively prosperous country. So conditions can arise, if they're bad enough internally, that leaders who fear democracy can benefit from it. That is a path to warm peace, but it is not one that the international system can produce. Regime change is indeed an internal process. And we have to remember it's a hard internal process because leaders are opposed to democracy. And they're opposed to democracy for a very simple reason. I mentioned how long dictators survive and how long democratic leaders survive in office. From the perspective of a citizen or from the perspective of a non-enfranchised immigrant or whomever, democracy is the best system in the world. It produces lots of public goods, it produces lots of opportunity, it increases productivity, and if it happens to be a democracy with easy citizenship rules, such as you have, such as the United States has, such as Japan does not have, it attracts tons of immigrants because they're going to be coming from miserable places to a place where they can get public benefits, get public goods, get opportunity, become citizens, and have a chance also of becoming influential. In Japan, also reasonably democratic, but not that democratic, it's almost impossible to become a citizen. So they don't immigrate. You don't see people migrating to Japan. You might think, well, Japanese is a very difficult language. It's difficult if you're an English speaker, but it's not so difficult if you are a Chinese speaker. You're in business right away. The problem is they don't give you the opportunity to become citizens. People didn't used to migrate to Switzerland except during the war, for obvious reasons. Because the Swiss didn't let people become citizens. They changed their rules and now people migrate to Switzerland. Okay, so for leaders, unlike citizens, citizens love democracy. For leaders, it's the worst political system. The average democratic leader is paid much less, this is the official deal, much less money than the average dictator is paid. And then besides the pay, there are the perks. Democratic leaders have perks. They don't match the sort of perks that Mobutu Sese Seko had. When Mobutu Sese Seko was overthrown, it was estimated that the national debt of Zaire was $60 billion and that his Swiss bank account was $60 billion. Kim Jong-un is the head of a country in which per capita income is less than $1,000. He inherited from his daddy $4 billion. Now you have to wonder if he's concerned about the well-being of the Korean people, the North Korean people. Maybe he would show a little largesse instead of executing so many. But the fact is, democracy, liberalization is bad for him. It may be great for the people, never going to happen as long as he can avoid it. He's living the good life. And he will be in office until somebody puts a bullet in his head or he dies in his sleep. All right. So when internal threats arise, for example, the Arab Spring, there are two ways that domestically leaders can respond to the threat to their hold on power. They can try to buy off the revolutionaries by liberalizing, as J.J. Rawlings did, giving people an opportunity to make more money. And then they have to expand the accountability of their government to match the policies that they're adopting. They don't do that very often. Or they can look at the situation and think, well, I'm producing too many benefits for people. What I should be producing is bribery to some people to go out on the street and bash in the heads of the people opposed to my regime. and become even more autocratic. That is the more common response to internal threats. If you think back to 2009, people took to the streets all over Iran claiming that Ahmadinejad's re-election was fraudulent. And the government sent onto the streets the Basij to go and bash in heads. Anybody happen to know who the head of the Basij was? The son of Ayatollah Khamenei. You know, you get a crony who will do your bidding, you pay him well, and they go out and they crush the revolution, which they succeeded in doing. Leaders understand that they are always at risk. In that, they differ from the way we often think about international politics when we think about states. State survival is rarely at risk. Occasionally it is at risk. I'm talking externally. States can fail internally. But state survival is rarely at external risk. It is sometimes, but rarely. The individual leader's survival is at risk every minute of every day. Italo Calvino, wonderful Italian novelist, wrote a wonderful novel in which he opens with a king sitting on the throne. And the king makes a statement. He has just become king. I have spent my life waiting for this moment to be on the throne. And now that I am on the throne, what can I do? I can never get up out of this chair because somebody else will take it. And while I'm sitting in this chair, I know every minute that somebody is plotting to cut off my head. Leaders are constantly at risk. States are only rarely at risk. So leaders have to focus more on their interest and their survival than the state's interests, that is the people's interests, or the state's survival. Of course, if the state were going to fail, they would probably fail too. But that's the rare threat. The big threat is somebody locally wants to knock them off and take their job. That, of course, is why Kim Jong-un executes so many senior people. That's why Uncle Take is a dead man. Uncle Take was his closest associate, his father's closest associate. But Uncle Take was taking. He had a deal. He was managing the economic relations with China, and too much money was going into his pocket instead of to Bureau 39, which was sending the money to Kim Jong-un. That was the end of him. So the realism perspective at the state level may be useful for great power conflicts, because in great power conflicts, the survival of the states involved in the conflict, are at risk. But for most international problems, that's not the case. For most international problems, what's at risk is the leader. And so it's the leader that we have to worry about. When internal threats arise, like the Arab Spring, as I said, there were two responses, and we saw these manifested. In Bahrain, the threat was crushed. In Egypt, it was not. The military sat on their hands, as they did, by the way, when Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran from France, when it was clear from the perspective of the military that the Shah was dying, and so he was no longer going to be paying them off. They better find somebody else who might view them as people to pay off. And I will suggest that the reason the military sat on their hands in Egypt was similar. There are a few conditions, in my view, that are necessary for a credible revolutionary threat. One is that people with a reasonable amount of money are facing economic crisis. The tourist industry was drying up in Egypt, other economic problems where educated middle-class people were not getting what they were accustomed to. The leader is either terminally ill, as was the rumor about Ben Ali in Tunisia, or the leader has the terminal illness that we all contract. He's old, as was Hosni Mubarak. When a leader is old, then the folks who are getting paid off, like the military, have to think, great, love Hosni Mubarak, done a wonderful job for me. What are the odds he's going to be there next year or the year after? Can I count on him to keep taking care of me? And the third is a loss of support. And in the case of Egypt, there was a dramatic, I thought, a student pointed this out to me. It was on page 23, I think, of the New York Times. I am willing to bet that it was on page 1 in Cairo. President Obama announced in February 2010 that he was going to reduce foreign aid to Egypt by $700 million to help pay for the effort in Afghanistan, because he didn't want to increase the burden of the American people. Nobody in the United States paid any attention. $700 million is here, or it's over there. What's the difference? It's $700 million, not in our pocket. But in Egypt, surely the response was, Hosni has been wonderful. 30 years of marvelous service to us. He no longer has the confidence of the United States. They no longer think he's important, or they take him for granted. The flow of money is drying up. People will understand that he no longer has a solid hold on his supporters, because he is no longer, you cannot pay people from the grave, or when you don't have it, you can't get blood out of a turnip. And so the military, at least this is what I thought in February 2010, that Mubarak will be gone, and that there are only 3 possible successor governments to Mubarak. A military dictatorship, a Muslim Brotherhood government, or a coalition between the military and the Muslim Brotherhood. My colleague at the time at Hoover, Fuad Ajami, was talking on the news every night. Egypt is a secular country. There is no possibility of a Muslim Brotherhood government. And nobody was listening to me, but I was saying there are only 2 groups in Egypt who are organized. It doesn't matter whether people are secular or not secular. It matters who's organized, who can deliver the vote. The military's organized, the Muslim Brotherhood's organized. There's nobody else. So, of course, you got a coalition government of the military and the Muslim Brotherhood. And eventually, the military figured out how they could come back. Out they go. We had a bogus election, in my opinion. And then we had another bogus election to elect the beloved civilian El-Sisi. Oh, he used to be a general. And Egypt is now where it is. That's how these things go. And we could think about Libya and the decisions to intervene as foreign powers in Libya on this unbelievably naive notion that somehow Libya was going to be made into a civil society, maybe even a democratic society, for which it had absolutely no prospect. When you have that much oil wealth and you have no tradition of democracy, and there is so much money to be had, you have factions who are fighting over the money. They're not fighting over making a liberal democracy. And as I used to joke to my students, if Muammar Gaddafi had just picked up the phone and given me a call, he would be there today. Why was there a revolution in Libya? He made big mistakes. One, he wanted the West to love him. He wanted Europe and the United States to think he was a better guy. So what did he do? He took Egypt from the second least free press in the neighborhood to the second freest press in the neighborhood. Don't help people to express their dissatisfaction and coordinate with each other to overthrow you by letting them report in the press whatever they want. Terrible mistake. Then he had another dumb idea. He took Egypt from one of the least educated country in the region. Libya, what did I say? Egypt, excuse me. Libya. He took Libya from one of the least educated countries in the region to one of the most educated countries in the region. Education is wonderful. Listen, we are in a university. We all like education. Educated people have ideas, independent ideas, maybe not the government's ideas. And if you're running an oil state, you don't need educated people. You need British Petroleum or Shell or ExxonMobil or Total. They can run the oil business for you, give you money, keep some for themselves, of course, they want to get paid, not train your people who could become troublemakers, hire foreigners to do the business, and they'll go away. They have no interest in running Libya. But instead, he educated his population. And then, the last straw, wanting the West to love him, he greatly diminished torture, making people less fearful of opposing the government. And we all know where Muammar Gaddafi, well, we don't all know where he is. We know where he isn't. All right. So internal threats could lead to democratic reform, as with J.J. Rawlings, but mostly they don't. They lead to rather unpleasant government. Now let me talk about that in the context of Israel, and I will wrap up. Peace in the long run must be good both for Israel and the Palestinians. Must be. Unambiguous that in the long run, peace is a good thing. Conflict is very costly, fighting is inefficient, burns a lot of money with no great positive effects unless one side absolutely crushes the other. But in the short run, conflict may be good for leaders. Not good for the state, but good for leaders. Leaders can keep their jobs longer through conflict. Carmelo mentioned I have a book coming out this summer called Spoils of War. A very brief little touch. This is a book that trashes George Washington, James Madison, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, etc. George W. Bush and Barack Obama. It's reasonably nice to JFK and very nice to Lyndon Johnson. We should ask ourselves a little quiz. What is better for a president's standing in history, and you can ask this of your prime ministers, presiding over the death of a lot of citizens in war, or presiding over peace and prosperity? The relationship between presiding over death in war and the president's standing among historians, it's like that. The more who are dead, the more they think you were great. Top for the United States, Abraham Lincoln, the greatest president, 750,000 Americans dead in a population of 31 million, over 1 million dead or wounded to die later. The relationship between producing prosperity, meaning average annual growth in per capita income, and the president's standing in history, is flat. There's no relationship. The war is bad for countries, but it can be very good for leaders. Now we think about your system. Somewhat similar to the German extreme PR system. What does this do? It gives outsized influence to fringe political parties, especially in your case, religious parties. So leaders need to worry about the support of those parties. They have to make big concessions to them. What is the long run for a political leader in a democracy? The next election. The next election is never very far away. Leaders often do things that they can readily anticipate will have bad consequences 10, 20 years down the road. Not their problem, somebody else's problem, and people will vote for it today, so they do it. This makes it extremely difficult to create peace. If, for example, your Prime Minister, Netanyahu, decided that he was going to freeze settlements to increase the odds of negotiating an agreement with the Palestinians. If he decided that today, tomorrow you would have a new Prime Minister. He understands that. So he doesn't, whether he believes it or not, doesn't make such a decision. Of course, when he doesn't freeze the settlements, the leaders of the Palestinian Authority doubt that he wants to make a deal, so no agreement is reached. How about on the other side of the ledger? Suppose Abbas said, look, we want to make progress. We abandon the right of return. He says that today. I don't know if it would take till tomorrow. Sometime between today and tomorrow, he would no longer be a political authority in Palestine. And with a pretty significant probability, he would have joined Muammar Gaddafi wherever he is. He would be a dead man. So, of course, he's not going to make such a proposal. Now, people sometimes think elections are important things. I like elections. Elections themselves are not necessary conditions for liberal, accountable government. Hong Kong, until just before it was turned over to China, never had an election. But it was an accountable, responsible government because of other structural features. Other places have elections, and they're not accountable. China has elections. North Korea has elections. Saddam Hussein had elections. He was very popular. He ran an election in which he got 98% of the vote, 2% died, and the next election he got 100% of the vote. I was very popular. You have elections, and your government swings. The Palestinian Authority had an election, and Hamas did very well in that election, and they have a schedule for elections, which it seems they've not quite lived up to. And when they are asked about this, they explain that, well, the two sides need to work out an agreement because of all the difficulties between them. Excuse me? That's what elections are for the people to work out a settlement of the two sides. But of course, if you don't have elections, you can stay in power much longer, which is what they're doing. So democracy doesn't guarantee compromises or concessions. It guarantees either one-sided conflict, one side crushes the other, then things work well, or conflict avoidance. That's not warm peace, but it may meet the definition of a nominal peace, more likely than it meets a cold peace in the Israeli-Palestinian case, and that at least might be some degree of progress. So let me conclude. The state-level, system-level perspective can be complemented by and adjusted by a leader-level focus. Domestic political constraints limit finding paths to peace far more than do systemic characteristics as suggested by liberalism or realism. The real liberalism and the real realism that matter are domestic.